This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
We
are cultivate.
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 We are cultivate.
Hello and welcome to a special mini-sode of Ye Olde Crime, the show where Maddie and I discuss the funny, strange, and obscure crimes of yesteryear every Wednesday. This special bi-weekly segment is called Can You Crack the Cramp-Word, which is slang for a difficult or obscure term, which I thought was very fitting. And with me today is Ann Foster from the Vulgar History podcast. And before we begin, I'd like to give her the chance to tell us a little more about herself and her show before we start. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm also excited and nervous about what the word is, what the words are that I'm going to have to guess. But I don't know. I read a lot of history stuff, so maybe I'll have some ideas. So I'm Ann Foster, and I host Vulgar History, which is, I describe it as a feminist women's history comedy podcast, which the words are equally important, I think, and I like to say that at the beginning of every episode so people know if that's your thing or if that's not your thing.
Yep,
You know?
Exactly.
So I added feminist, because the history that I look at, we're always like yelling about the patriarchy and, elevating the stories of women and other marginalized people. Women's history, which is most of my episodes are talking about women from history, although I've been getting into interesting people who are not women a little bit more lately. But I feel like feminist women's history can include other genders as well. The way that, like, what I call men's history, I just recently saw a list. It was like, these are the 100 people who changed the world the most, and it was like Napoleon, Winston Churchill. It was like all these men, and then it's like Joan of Arc, then like more men.
Yep.
So I'm like kind of like that. So I talk about mostly women, but every now and then not a woman. And yeah, and my whole approach to telling history is very much like women focused primarily. Like, I have no interest in great men of history. There's so many people who've talked about them, or like wars and battles. So it's just like, so it's like, what were the women up to? But especially like emotionally, what's like the social history, like the gossip. I find that so much more interesting than like this alliance with this country or whatever. And then I say comedy podcast at the end, just so people know that it's not a serious podcast, because history is silly. And I don't think we need to be reverent about it. So it's like, I do like so much research. It's very like, I don't want to say like historically accurate, but like I do my work, but then I deliver it in like a conversational fun way, because I think like with your podcast, like people who, it's not for people who are interested in history listen to both our podcasts, but I think it appeals to people who are interested in just stories or like true crime or whatever. Like, I want to broaden it, and not just people. You don't have to know anything about history to listen to my podcast, is my hope.
Yep, exactly. So that is the perfect segue to my first question, which is, what got you interested in history?
Gosh, when I was, I'm going to say 6 or 7 years old, I had a serious Pompeii fixation. I feel like a lot of people, just who I've like interacted with online or in real life, people have either like ancient Egypt, Pompeii, Titanic, Anastasia Romanoff. Like, these are kind of like the major, there's so many children's books about all of those things.
Yep.
So if you're a kid and you're interested in it, there's so many books. And Pompeii was my thing. I remember there was this book that was called Pompeii, ... buried alive, !
Oh, nice.
It was so interesting to me and so fascinating to me. So that's the first like real history thing I remember being interested in. Like, otherwise I was interested in like fairy tales and whatever, but that was the first like, oh my gosh, this is a thing that really happened. And then from then on, like as you're growing up as like a kid with these interests, then I got into like an ancient Egypt phase and like an
Yep.
ancient Rome phase. And then the one that was very foundational for me was like the Six Wives of Henry VIII.
Oh, yes. Yes.
That was the first time I was probably a teenager when I was really into that initially. And that was where I first read like a book written for adult. I think it was David Starkey's book about the Six Wives. And that's where I was like,
Mhm.
oh man, like, which was, there's so many other better books you can read about it now. But at that time, it was the first book that was sort of like interrogating who they really were as people and not just
Yep.
kind of like divorced, beheaded, whatever. And I was just like, oh wow, if you really like dive into these stories, there's so much that you can know about it. Then
Mhm.
luckily, I had a really excellent grade 10 or 11, I think grade 10 history teacher who made it all. Mrs. Hopkins was her name. And she talked and she had this like sassy attitude, kind of like Ursula the Sea Witch from The Little
Nice.
Mermaid, is how I would
Nice.
describe her. And she just made everything so interesting. And then I was like, I guess I'll do a history degree in university. And then I did. So it's just always been an interest of mine, but it's never in a who won the battle sort of
Yes.
way. It's always like, what are the weird stories? How does it kind of feel not so different from now? Those sorts of things. Just like thinking of people as people, but just like with crazy stories.
Yeah. When you mentioned like Titanic and like the Romanovs, like those were two of the big ones for me. I'm trying to think what other ones really kind of sparked my interest. I had a Titanic phase. I feel like everybody has like a small Titanic phase, whether that's like
Mhm.
you really loved the movie and that was your only point of entry for it. Like that was your only, what is the word that I'm trying to think of? Like, uh,
Introduction?
yes, like
I don't know. Yeah.
that was as deep as you went with it, was just watching
Right,
the
right.
movie as opposed to like reading books or watching documentaries or whatever. Like whereas I was like, "Oh, who are the people that were on the Titanic and what are the stories and how about all these orphan children?" Like that kind
Mhm.
of thing. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And now like kids today, there's this series for kids, the I Survived, where it's like I survived the Titanic. I survived. They get like worryingly recent. There's like I survived Hurricane Katrina. I'm just like this isn't Oh wait, this is historical now.
Yeah, like the Great Chicago Fire was one too that I remember like hearing about. Like, yeah.
Yeah. No, exactly. Like kids love reading about disasters.
Mhm.
And I think Titanic is like a lot of people's entry point into just a real love of, yeah, I don't know. So like, and that to me, like some people might not think like, oh, that's history, but it's like, no, it is. It's like, because that
Yeah.
can veer into like a true crime interest,
Yep.
and that could be how some people define it. But for me, it turned into just like, you read about Pompeii and then you like take a step back to be like, wait, what was the Roman Empire? And you take a step back to be like, oh,
Yep.
wait, what was like ancient Egypt? And then like I've just been
Yeah.
reading about stuff ever since. Yeah.
I think too, like learning about the Greek and Roman gods was also like an entry point for me into like learning more about those
Mm,
cultures because I would like read these stories about, like Hades and Persephone and things like that. And I was like, oh man, I want to learn more about the people that like came up with these stories and these, they're not really characters, but they kind of are characters. You know what I mean? So,
yeah.
or like learning about Pocahontas when, that movie came out and the real story about her, which is super sad. But, most of history is super sad. So,
Absolutely, absolutely. It's either like bananas, funny, goofy, or it's just like the most depressing thing you've ever heard. Yeah. Or
yes,
both, or
exactly.
both.
It can be both in the same story. You can be like, that is hilarious. That is also super tragic. Like,
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Exactly, like, "Oh, man, these goofballs," like, "Oh, no," and then they all died of plague.
yeah.
Ooh.
It's
Yeah.
like, ooh. Maybe I shouldn't have laughed about this at the beginning. But yeah. So you also interview authors on your podcast.
Mhm.
What do you look for in a potential guest?
That's a great question. I think, honestly, it's all about the book. Like, I just read
Mhm.
about I'm always on the lookout for it for myself, just to read for my own interest.
Yep.
Sometimes when I'm researching, I just happen upon it. Like there's a couple guests I have coming up later this season. I'm doing a whole season about like Marie Antoinette and the French Revolution and
Yes.
stuff.
Yes.
And
Nice.
as I do that, like I'm finding like what are the new books coming out, and I'm like, wait, when did this book come out? Like, wait, can this person just come on the show with me? So sometimes it's like with fiction or something, I'm just like, oh, this is a figure who I've always wanted to talk about that on the show, but maybe I don't have time to research it myself. But someone who's written a book about it, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, they know that story inside out. So I just feel
Yes.
like this is a way that I can share the story with my listeners and also promote the person's book. But it's
Yes.
very much about, I think there are always authors of books that are about a person. Like
Yes.
I often, every now and then, I guess I've had people on about like, tell me the history of patriarchy, but it's mostly just like a person's story. And I love talking to people who are passionate about things, and someone who's
Yes.
just spent a year or two only thinking about this one person. Like they have so much enthusiasm
Yeah.
for it. And I feel like instead of me reading it and summarizing it, it's like, why don't I just bring on the author?
Exactly. We've been lucky in we've had authors like reach out to be on the show, which I think is amazing and awesome
Hmm.
because I've read some truly amazing books, having them reach out and they're like amazing guests. And it's like you said, like they're so knowledgeable about whatever they're talking about, like whatever the subject is, and it's just a pleasure to hear from their point of view whatever for the topic is, or it is just kind of a fun way to introduce something wholly new to our listeners without having to do the research yourself. Because sometimes it's like way too much.
No, exactly. And that's honestly, that's part of where I started doing it. Was I was just like, I wanted to get a more regular release schedule,
Hmm.
because instead of doing like, here's like 8 episodes, then I take a month off, I wanted, but like, I don't have time. Like it's just me. I
Yep.
do my own research. I do my own recording. So I was like, I can't do an episode every week, but these people, like authors, are so excited. I think also I'm writing a book right now too. And all I want to do is talk about this person that I'm writing this biography of. So I think the authors
Yep.
are just excited to finally get to talk about this thing that they've been only thinking about.
Well, and it's a great opportunity to not only like meet these amazing authors, but like you said, like promote their book to like a wider audience because you never know, like even if a fraction of your listeners purchase their book, like that's totally worth the time they spent talking to you. And we've been fortunate enough where I have authors that are like, I would love to come back, and I'm like, that would be amazing, I would
Mhm.
love to have you back on. So it's like having that kind of relationship with somebody is really cool and fun. And
Yeah, I wanted to say too, you mentioned that like you've been approached by authors, and I started, most of the authors I have on are people who I invite,
Mhm.
usually who are not familiar with the podcast. There's been like twice where people actually were fans, and I'm like, what? You know about me? But I do get like I do have some relationships now with like publicists and stuff who are like, hey, here's the new book that they're promoting. So like that's really helpful too, because if it's, sometimes it is a book that aligns really well with what I'm doing. So
Yeah.
that's another way I find them too. But the
Yeah.
majority are just like, I obsessively look to see what new historical books are coming out, and
Mhm.
then like there's just a vibe. I'm like, oh, that would be good for the show. Or if it's a
Yeah.
person who I want to talk about, I'm like, oh, I don't have to research them anymore. Ha ha ha.
Yeah. I know, like, I have a few authors that I would love to reach out to, but I'm, like, too scared that they're just gonna say no, which is it's like that imposter syndrome thing that you got where you're like,
Yeah.
"Oh, why would they wanna talk to me, this, like, small-time podcaster?" But I need to just bite the bullet and do it.
I will say there's been a couple people I reached out to where I was just like, ha ha ha, I can't believe it. Like, well, and I look up the book and then you see like, who's the publicist? And I'm like, haha, nothing, this will never happen. And then I'm like, wait, and they want to do it. I'm just like, what? So yeah, there's been like once I think where someone, it was like a very, 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 very famous writer. And I'm like, I'm not surprised that they are not doing every random podcast, but
Yeah.
basically everyone says yes. Authors like to talk about their books. That's what
Yeah.
I would say.
I've had some people, like, local authors. I reached out to one, and he was, like, very excited to be on the podcast, and he had written the book, like, 2 years before,
Mhm.
so he was, like, trying to remember the story as we're talking, and he was like, "Oh my god, yeah," because I would read the book before so I could ask intelligent questions
Yeah.
about the book,
Mhm.
and he was like, "Oh yeah, I totally forgot about that part," like, so that's kinda fun too, to, like, talk to an author, and then they're like, "Oh, I can't believe that part resonated with you," or like they get excited about the parts that you really liked about their book. So,
I will say that too. I do, when I have authors on my show, I do always read their book.
yep.
Partially just to make sure that it's like a good fit for the show, but also because I
Mhm.
want to talk to them intelligently.
Yes.
And from what I understand in terms of imposter syndrome, there's clearly a lot of podcasters out there who don't read the books, and the authors are
Yes.
so grateful to talk to someone who's read the book.
Yes. Every author I've talked to, they say the same thing. They're like, usually in interviews at the end, they'll be like, "Oh, that sounds like a really good book. I'll have to read that." And I always say, I feel like it's a disservice to you and your time if I don't take the time to read your book so we can have an intelligent conversation together. Like, I feel like that's just
Mhm.
common decency to, like,
Yeah.
if I'm gonna take your time, your precious time, I should do my own research, or the bare minimum is reading your book so we can have
Yeah.
a rapport.
No, exactly. So just know that there's a lot of people who don't do that. So I think authors will be really excited to talk to someone like you who
Oh,
actually cares.
reads the book, yeah, and cares about it, yeah.
Mhm.
So last thing I wanted to talk about is, so you've written like a number of pieces that have been published, like whether printed or just like shared online. Are there any particular topics that you enjoy writing more than others, or like researching and writing more?
What I like best, what I find, well, I guess I like it best, and that's why I find it the easier or more pleasant thing, is somebody's story. I like telling somebody's story like birth to death. Like I like just
Sure.
looking at someone, but then sort of what in most of the writing I've done has been sort of like, hey, here's this person and here's what they did. And I love the discovery process. I love finding various different things that people have written about it and then finding my own way to tell the story, like
Hmm.
finding an angle that other people haven't really thought about or haven't really put together. And often that stuff like whatever, like the book I'm writing now, the only thing I'm capable of talking about. But it's like, when you talk like the woman I'm researching, so her name is Carolina Brunswick, and so every book about her mentions like, oh yeah, she took to her bed, or like her doctor came to visit, but no one's actually thought about like what symptoms did she actually have? Like was like, and I'm like, my take is like this is a woman living with a chronic illness, and no one's really delved about like, well, what does that mean, and how does that affect her whole life and her personality? So
Yes.
I love like that discovery process and then finding a new way to talk about somebody. I have been like things that I've written that are not just a biography of somebody are more like I was hired and told like we want an article about this thing, and that's fine and that's interesting too, but I really really I love people and I love people's stories. So
Hmm.
that's what I find brings me the most pleasure,
Sure.
to learn and to really really feel like I understand a person who lived in oldie
Yeah.
times.
Yep. I agree. Well, that's the last of my questions. So are you ready
Mhm.
to move on to the
Oh my
slang
gosh,
term
yes.
portion?
Oh my gosh, okay. Okay.
So, like I mentioned before we started recording, I do have a sentence that uses it. So, if you want the sentence, I'm happy to share it with you.
Okay, but I do know from your podcast, sometimes the sentence is not helpful.
Yes, exactly. Sometimes it's like,
But
okay, I get it. And other times you're like, I am more confused than ever now. So,
yeah, yeah.
okay. So, your first term is upper story.
Mm. Okay, okay. Can I have the sentence?
His upper story is unfurnished.
Okay, I know it can't just mean property and furniture. Upper
Hmm.
story. I'm gonna guess it means so it's his. So I wonder if that means like his head of hair or like his facial hair, like his upper story, like his upper part of him. Or or it could mean his upper story is like his brain. His brain is unfurnished. Like he's not smart, he's unintelligent. I'll go with my first gut instinct that it's about hair, a head of hair.
You were actually right the second time. It is
Oh, really?
about a person's head, but someone that doesn't know very much.
Oh, okay. His upper story is unfurnished.
Yeah, so the upper story is the person's head, but if you say they're
Yeah.
unfurnished, that means they're not very smart. There's not a
There's
lot
not
up
a
there.
brain there. There's not a
Yeah,
brain
there's
there. There's
nothing
just
up
a
there.
skull. That's it. Okay. Okay.
So, according to Green's Dictionary of Slang, which I use quite frequently, I'm realizing that term upper story was first introduced in 1751, which I think is kind of fun.
That's so interesting. It's just interesting too, just thinking about like what culturally was going on. Like, were so many people talking about furnished and unfurnished real
Yeah.
estate that it just turned into that's just interesting how that would become a thing. Yeah.
Well, and if you kind of think about like belfry, like when people would say like there's bats in the belfry type of thing, and that's also talking
Mm.
about your head. So it's like it's weird that homes and like places that you live in and like parts of the house, like the ceiling, like the roof of the house is like the parts that people associate with your head. Although it kind of makes sense because it's the top of a structure, but still it's kind of
Yeah.
weird. Like I never
No,
really
it's
thought about that
interesting.
before.
And honestly, like just what I've been reading recently about like that era, like the 1700s and medicine, like frankly, I'm impressed that people would even casually know that your brain is what does your thinking, because
Yeah.
what people are doing medically was bananas.
Yeah. It's terrifying, like, thinking about it and being like, "That yeah, that was science."
Yeah, but that they even knew, like, "Oh, the brain is what does the thinking." Like, "Oh, good! You know that? Okay. Okay.
That's great. I'm
Step
so
1."
impressed.
Yeah.
You checked the first box. So, your second term is to throw up the sponge.
Throw up the sponge.
Mhm.
Okay, and the sentence for that is?
Now he'll throw up the sponge, there ain't no more use.
Well, okay, I've got sort of like a narrative in my mind. Like, I think this is based on some sort of job where a person is doing something with this sponge. I don't know, shining shoes or washing windows. And at the end, like literally for some reason, whatever this task is, you would then throw up the sponge when you're done. But then it would take that thing that you see people do to mean, I don't know, it would either be like giving up, like you're throwing it, like throwing in the towel, that's, I think that's what it's reminding me of. Like if you're giving up even though you haven't succeeded in doing what you were doing. I don't think that there would be a slang term that just means like I finished my job. That's like how,
I'm done with my task today.
yeah, so I'm gonna guess it means like giving up, like not being able to complete your task.
You are 100% right.
Yes.
So it means to submit or to give up the struggle. And the term comes from the practice of throwing up the sponge used to cleanse like prize fighters' faces,
Oh.
kind of like as a signal that the fight's done. Like this person's done, and then they throw up the sponge after they've like wiped off their face.
The like blood covered sponge is just like this person is unconscious and we're
Yeah, we're done.
it's very it's dramatic though, like to throw it up rather than to throw it down
Yeah, like it
feels
makes me think
significant.
of like putting up the white flag. You know what I mean? Like kind of like
Yeah.
yeah, like you said, I'm throwing in the towel. I'm done. I can't do anymore.
Throwing up the sponge. It's so I love that you do this series, this mini series, because it's like, when you think about, well, I was like time travel, but it's also just like when you watch a movie that's set in olden times,
Yeah.
like it would be incomprehensible if people actually talked throughout the way they would have, like if they use the slang,
Yeah.
like even though it's like English language, like you wouldn't understand it. So, and that's why they just I don't know, Bridgerton or whatever. It's like every now and then
Yeah.
they throw in like one word
Yeah.
but they, like, act out so we know it, like, you can tell. But if someone's just talking and just using all these slang, I'd be like, "Is this English? Is this
Am
are
I
there
having a
subtitles?
stroke right now? Like
These are these is this German? Is this actually German?" Which always sounds to me like almost English, but not. I don't know, it's so interesting, and then just when you're around people and everybody knows what you mean, it's interesting. Yeah.
yeah.
I'm really proud of myself. I basically got them both right.
You did really well. Like you essentially got both right.
Mhm, I just second guessed myself with
You
the
just
first
second
one, yeah.
guessed yourself for the first one. And this term was surprisingly introduced very late. It was introduced in 1845.
Hmm,
But I suppose that was kind of the time where bare knuckle boxing was kind of all the rage. Like that was
true.
the thing people went to go see.
Yeah, and if people aren't going there, then you don't see the sponge being thrown, and then why would you use that? You wouldn't know
Yeah.
what it meant. Yeah.
Yeah. You'd be like, what? Why are people throwing sponges? I don't get it.
Yeah.
It's full of mold. And then you just like throw it at somebody.
I know, but what's funny about throwing up is it will inevitably fall back down. So, like, you're
Exactly.
throwing it up, unless it's like a sponge and that's where I was picturing someone like window washing or something, and you throw it up and it would just like sit on a ledge or something.
Oh,
But
yeah, until, like, you pulley yourself up to, like, the next window to clean it or something.
yeah, I was coming up with a real such a complicated like situation. But
There was a advanced pulley system, it was
yeah, yeah.
well, on that note, I would like to thank Anne for joining me today for Can You Crack the Cramp-Word? And before we go, can you tell our listeners where they can find you on social media and when new episodes of your show come out?
Absolutely. So, Vulgar History, which is my podcast, new episodes come out every Wednesday. I mean, depending on your time zone. Maybe it's really late on Tuesday night. I don't know where you live. New episodes come out every Wednesday. You can get it in all the podcast places. I recently it's on Spotify, it's on Apple Podcasts. And I recently just got the podcast on YouTube. There's not videos, but I recently learned that people listen to podcasts on YouTube. And I thought,
Yes.
okay, so it is there if that is a place where people go. And then in terms of social media, my primary / only place where I post stuff is usually Instagram, which is just Vulgar History Pod, because a lot of what I want to post is visuals. Like I just want to post a lot of pictures. I don't do video or anything.
Yep.
But also I'm really active there in my stories too. I really like to interact with my listeners. Like after an episode, I'll put out polls or like
Sure.
ask people's feedback and stuff. Like, so that's where I am. Vulgar History Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. And then on Instagram, Vulgar History Pod. I do want to say, if you look up on Instagram Vulgar History, that's not me. That is an erotic account that
Oh, yes.
claimed that name before I did. And you know what? God bless. Vulgar History Pod is if you want to see me and my stuff. Vulgar History if you want to see some erotic, I don't know, feet stuff or whatever.
Well, on that note, as always, I'm Lindsay, and I'll see you next time with another tale as old as crime.